Out on the prairie, the silence had teeth. It wasn't the quiet of a sleeping world. It was the quiet of a world that had been murdered. Ash fell from the sky like soft gray snow, coating everything in a blanket of grief. Smoke, thick and oily, curled up from the blackened bones of what used to be a home, a life, a family. And in the middle of it all stood a little girl. Her name was Clara May Delaney. She was 7 years old. Her dress was a mess of soot and tears, the hem scorched black. Her feet were bare, caked in mud and ash. In one tiny hand, she clutched a tin pail, gripping it so hard her knuckles were white. Her other hand was empty. She didn't cry. The fire had burned the tears right out of her. All that was left was a hollow space inside, a silence that matched the prairie. She was the only one left, the only survivor of the Delaney Homestead massacre. The wind whispered through the tall grass, trying to tell a story she already knew. The story was written in the scorch marks on the earth. It was written in the boot prints and the spent bullet casings glinting in the sun. And it was written in the single stark Apache arrow stuck in the doorframe, a dark promise that had been kept. This was a place of ghosts now, her ghosts. But as she stood there staring at the arrow, a strange thought flickered in her mind. Something was wrong. The arrow, it wasn't like the others she'd seen in pictures. The fletching was different. The carving on the shaft, it was strange. It was a detail so small, it should have been meaningless. But in a world where everything had been taken from her, the small things were all she had left. And that one small wrong detail was a seed of doubt planted in the burnt soil of her life, a seed that would in time grow into a terrifying truth. Late that afternoon they came, a small group of riders, dark shapes against the endless sky. Sheriff Eli Braddock was at the front, his face a roadmap of hard years and regrets he didn't talk about. He looked at the smoking ruins, at the little girl standing like a statue, and a muscle in his jaw twitched. This was his town, his responsibility, and he had failed. Behind him rode the preacher, Preacher Loudon, a man dressed in black robes that seemed to soak up the sunlight and spit back judgment. His face was thin, his eyes like two chips of cold, blue ice. He saw the devastation not as a tragedy, but as a sermon waiting to be preached, a lesson from a wrathful God. "She alive?" the sheriff asked, his voice rough as gravel. He didn't get any closer. None of them did. They just sat on their horses watching her like she was some kind of wild creature. "Looks it," one of the deputies mumbled. Finally, the sheriff swung down from his horse. His boots crunched in the ash. He walked toward Clara slowly, like approaching a spooked foal. He crouched down, his knees popping. He looked at her empty eyes, at the tin pail she was clutching. He started to reach for it, then thought better of it. "Clara May," he said, his voice softer now. "It's over, darling. You're safe." Safe. The word was a lie, a bitter joke. She knew it. He knew it. But she was too tired to argue. She let him lift her up, her small body stiff and unyielding in his arms. He wrapped her in an itchy wool blanket and set her in the back of a wagon. As they rolled away, she didn't look back. She couldn't. The preacher rode alongside the wagon, muttering about heathens and God's righteous fury. He talked about the Apache, painting them as devils with brown skin and black hearts. The men nodded along, their faces grim. It was a simple story, a comforting one. Settlers were good, Apaches were evil, an eye for an eye. But Clara wasn't listening. She was looking at her tin pail. It wasn't empty. Tucked in the bottom, hidden beneath a layer of dust, was a single small object. A bead. It was carved from dark wood, with a strange red symbol painted on it. A symbol that looked just like the one she'd seen carved on the arrow in the doorframe. It wasn't an Apache bead. She'd seen their beadwork before on trading blankets. This was something else, something different, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that the simple story everyone believed was a lie. Grady's Crossing wasn't much of a town. It was more of a rumor held together by spit and suspicion. A single dusty street, a few crooked buildings, and a whole lot of eyes that watched you from behind drawn curtains. When the wagon carrying Clara rolled into town, the whispers started immediately. They didn't see a little girl who needed help. They saw an omen, a ghost, the living reminder of a nightmare they all shared. Women crossed themselves. Men spat tobacco juice in the dust and looked away. They pitied her, sure, but mostly they feared her. They feared what her survival meant. They feared the violence that had touched her might be contagious. Sheriff Braddock didn't know what to do with her. He ended up giving her a cot in the broom closet of the jailhouse. It smelled of dust and rust and old sorrow. Just for a few days, he promised, but his eyes wouldn't meet hers. We'll find you a proper home. Clara didn't say a word. She just curled up on the cot, clutching her tin pail, the strange bead a secret, cold weight in her hand. Days turned into a week. She started wandering the town, a silent little ghost in a borrowed dress. The other children avoided her. "That's the ghost girl," they'd whisper. "Her ma and pa got killed by the savages. She never cried. She never spoke. She just walked, her bare feet tracing patterns in the dust, the tin pail her only companion. She was looking for something, though she didn't know what. An answer, a clue, something to explain the wrongness of the arrow and the mystery of the bead. Then one morning she wandered farther than ever before, past the livery stable, past the edge of town, out into the open country where the wild things lived. The sun beat down on her head, but she didn't feel it. She was being pulled by something, a feeling, a sound on the edge of hearing. It was a cry, faint, weak, almost lost in the wind. Not an animal, not a bird. It was the sound of a baby. Her heart, which she thought had turned to stone, gave a painful lurch. She followed the sound, her legs moving faster, pushing through tall grass and thorny brush. The cry led her to a scorched grove of trees, a place that had been touched by a different fire. And there, tucked into a shallow hollow in the earth, half hidden by a burned blanket, was a baby. Its skin was dusky, its face smudged with soot. It was wrapped in a hide decorated with beads, Apache beads, real ones. Its tiny fists were clenched, and its eyes, dark and impossibly deep, blinked up at her. Clara dropped to her knees, her breath hitched in her throat. This had to be a trick, a mirage born of sun and grief. But the baby whimpered again, a real sound, a sound of pure, helpless misery. And in that moment, Clara didn't see an enemy. She didn't see a savage, or a devil, or the cause of her pain. She saw a creature even more alone than she was. Something inside her, something fierce and ancient and protective, broke through the numbness. She reached out, her hand trembling, and gently touched the baby's cheek. It was warm, real, an Apache child, left for dead in the middle of nowhere. She looked around, her eyes scanning the horizon. No one, nothing, just the wind and the silence. Why was he here? Where were his people? And then she saw it. On the blood-specked hide he was wrapped in, tucked into the beadwork, was a symbol, a flash of dark wood and red paint. She fumbled for her tin pail, her fingers shaking as she pulled out the bead she'd found in the ashes of her home. She held them side by side. They were identical. The world tilted on its axis. The ground beneath her seemed to fall away. The bead from her home, the symbol on this child, they were the same. The story everyone knew, the story of an Apache raid, was not just a lie. It was a cover-up. And this tiny, helpless baby was somehow at the very heart of it. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew one thing for sure. This child wasn't the cause of the massacre. He was a victim of it, just like her. She carried him back toward town, her mind reeling. The baby nestled against her chest was a warm, fragile weight. He was the answer to a question she hadn't even known how to ask. But he was also a danger, a secret that could get them both killed. The whispers started before she even reached the main street. A ranch hand saw her from a distance, cradling the bundle. By the time she passed the saloon, the story had already twisted into something ugly. "Saw her with a baby," someone muttered. "An Injun baby." "Thievin' from the dead," another spat. "Just like 'em." The fear in Grady's Crossing was a living thing, and it had found a new target. The next morning was Sunday. Preacher Loudon stood at his pulpit, his face flushed with holy fire. He didn't mention Clara by name, but everyone knew who he was talking about. "There is a serpent among us," he thundered, his voice echoing in the small church. "A child who walks with the enemy. Blinded by a false sympathy, she has taken a viper to her bosom. The blood of her own parents cries out from the ground, yet she comforts the spawn of their killers." The congregation murmured in agreement. Their fear, sanctified by the preacher's words, was hardening into hate. After the service, a woman saw Clara walking by and deliberately spat in the dust near her feet. Sheriff Braddock found her near the stables, his face grim. "Clara May, you gotta listen to me," he said, crouching to look her in the eye. "This ain't safe. What you're doing. Folks are stirred up. You can't keep this child." "He's just a baby," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. It was the first time she'd spoken in weeks. The sheriff sighed, a long, weary sound. "I know that. You know that. But they don't." He looked at the baby, then back at her. His eyes were full of a strange mix of pity and frustration. "Where did you find him?" Clara just shook her head. She couldn't tell him. She couldn't show him the bead. Who would believe her? A 7-year-old girl against the word of an entire town? Against the story that made everything simple and clean? She was trapped. That night, the whispers turned into shouts. A drunken group of men gathered outside the saloon, their voices loud and angry. They were talking about forming a posse, about taking care of the problem. They weren't just talking about the baby anymore. They were talking about her, the ghost girl, the traitor. A shadow detached itself from the wall of the livery stable. It was Tommy Keene, the stable boy. He was a lanky kid with oil-stained hands and a limp from a horse that had rolled on him years ago. He was an outcast, just like her. "You gotta run," he hissed, his eyes wide with fear. "They're not just talking. I heard 'em. The preacher's with 'em. They're getting mean." Clara clutched the baby tighter. Run? Run where? The world outside Grady's Crossing was a vast, empty wilderness, but the world inside it had become a cage filled with monsters. Tommy pressed something into her hand, a small cloth sack. "It ain't much," he mumbled. "Some jerky, a little water. It's all I got." He glanced over his shoulder, then back at her. "Follow the dry creek bed north. It'll hide your tracks for a while. Go now, before it's too late." And with that, he melted back into the shadows. Clara looked down at the sleeping baby in her arms. She looked at the small sack of supplies. She had a choice: stay and face the mob, or run into the unforgiving wilderness with a baby that wasn't hers, hunted by the very people who were supposed to protect her. It wasn't much of a choice at all. As the last lights in town winked out, she slipped out the back of the jailhouse. The night air was cool on her skin. She moved like a phantom, past the tilted wooden crosses of the cemetery, past the edge of the world she knew, and into the scrubland where the moonlight painted everything in shades of silver and gray. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she couldn't stay. Every step was an act of rebellion. Every breath was a defiance. She was no longer a ghost. She was a guardian. And as she walked into the vast, dark unknown, she whispered a promise to the sleeping child in her arms. "I won't let them have you." The prairie was a sea of brown and gold, stretching to an endless horizon. For 2 days, Clara walked. The sun was a hammer, the wind a constant thief, stealing the moisture from her skin. Her shoes, worn and too big to begin with, fell apart. She walked barefoot, the hot, cracked earth blistering the soles of her feet. She didn't stop. The baby was her compass. His needs were her map. When he cried, she found shade. When he was hungry, she shared the last of Tommy's jerky, chewing it herself until it was soft enough for him to gum. She learned to read the land, to find the hidden seeps of water, to recognize the edible berries from the poisonous ones. She was a 7-year-old girl, but she was becoming something else, something harder, something fierce. On the 3rd day, she gave him a name. She was sitting under the shade of a lone mesquite tree, watching him sleep. He was so quiet, so stoic. He rarely cried. His dark eyes just watched her, seeming to understand everything. "I can't just call you baby," she whispered. "You're quiet, but you're strong, like a little bear cub. That's it. I'll call you Nkosi. It sounds strong." Nkosi. It felt right. She said it again, and the baby blinked, as if in agreement. That night the fever came. It started subtly, a warmth to his skin that felt wrong. By morning he was hot to the touch, his breathing shallow. A whimper escaped his lips, a sound of such pure misery it tore at Clara's heart. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her exhaustion. She couldn't lose him. Not now. He was all she had. He was the only thing that made sense in this broken world. She soaked her shawl in a muddy creek and laid it on his forehead. She crushed wild mint leaves and held them under his nose. Nothing worked. The fever was burning through him, and she was helpless to stop it. By the fifth day, she was desperate. Her water was gone. The jerky was a memory. Nkosi was limp in her arms, his whimpers growing weaker. She stumbled on, driven by a raw, primal instinct. Just one more ridge. Just one more canyon. That's when she heard the hoofbeats. She dove behind a cluster of boulders, her heart hammering against her ribs. Peeking through a crack, she saw them. Two riders, silhouetted against the sky. They were moving slowly, methodically, their eyes scanning the ground. Trackers. They were hunting her. The posse from Grady's Crossing had not given up. A new kind of fear seized her. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about capture. About being dragged back to face the preacher's judgment and the town's hate. About them taking Nkosi away from her. The thought was unbearable. She waited until the riders passed, then scrambled down the far side of the ridge, moving as fast as she could. She didn't run in a straight line. She zigzagged, using the terrain to cover her path, just like she'd seen foxes do. She walked through rocky creek beds, through thick brush, anything to hide her tracks. She walked until her legs gave out, until the moon was high in the sky. She found a small hollow under the roots of a dead cottonwood tree and collapsed, pulling Nkosi close. He was barely breathing. His skin was on fire. She closed her eyes, and for the first time since the massacre, she prayed. She prayed to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore, making a desperate bargain. Please, she whispered into the darkness, save him. Take me, but save him. A footstep crunched nearby. Her eyes snapped open. She froze, every muscle tensed. A figure was standing at the edge of the hollow, a dark shape against the moonlight. It wasn't the trackers. It was Tommy Keene. I told you they were coming, he said, his voice a low whisper. He looked haggard, his face smudged with dirt. He must have ridden all night. He knelt and placed another small sack on the ground. A full canteen, more food, a thick wool vest. How did you find me? Clara breathed, her voice trembling. I followed the buzzards, he said, not looking at her. They follow folks who are about to die. Sheriff's got a real posse now. 10 men. The preacher's been telling him God wants that baby dead. He finally looked at her, his eyes full of a helpless sorrow. He's sick, ain't he? The baby. Clara could only nod, a fresh wave of despair washing over her. Tommy looked at the limp form in her arms. There's an old man, he said, speaking quickly. A hermit. Lives up in the canyons. They call him the man of the mountain. Folks say he's different. Knows things. Old medicine. He's your only chance. He pointed toward a series of jagged peaks that clawed at the night sky. Head for the tallest one. Look for a canyon with a single dead tree at its mouth. Go. Now. He stood to leave, then hesitated. Clara, be careful. The man of the mountain. He don't take kindly to visitors, and there's stories about him, dark ones. Before she could ask what he meant, he was gone, disappearing as silently as he had come. Clara looked at the towering peaks in the distance. She looked down at Nkosi, his life fading like a guttering candle flame. Dark stories or not, she had no other choice. She had to find the man of the mountain. She pulled on the vest, grabbed the supplies, and with a strength born of pure desperation, she stood and began to walk toward the mountains, toward a man who was either her last hope or her final doom. The canyons were a maze of rock and shadow. The air grew thin and cold. Clara's lungs burned with every step. She climbed, her fingers raw, her bare feet bleeding, Nkosi a dead weight in a sling she'd fashioned from her shawl. The world had shrunk to this single desperate task. Find the canyon with the dead tree. She saw it at dusk on the 8th day, a skeletal, white tree standing like a sentinel at the mouth of a narrow chasm. Hope, fragile and terrifying, fluttered in her chest. She stumbled into the canyon, her voice a raw croak. "Hello? Is anyone here? Please, help me." Silence. The only answer was the echo of her own voice bouncing off the cold stone walls. The canyon was empty. Despair, heavy and final, settled over her. She had failed. She sank to the ground, pulling Nokosi from the sling. His eyes were closed. His chest barely moved. She rocked him back and forth, tears finally streaming down her face. Silent, hot tracks in the dust on her cheeks. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry, Nokosi." "Tears won't fix him." The voice came from the shadows, rough as granite. Clara looked up, her heart leaping into her throat. A man emerged from a crack in the rock wall she hadn't even seen. He was tall and lean, his face a landscape of wrinkles, his eyes hidden in the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. He carried no gun, but he moved with a dangerous stillness. This was the man of the mountain, the hermit, the subject of dark stories. He looked at her, at the baby, his expression unreadable. "You're trespassing," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "He's dying," Clara pleaded, holding Nokosi out. "Tommy Keene sent me. He said you knew medicine." The man's eyes narrowed at the mention of Tommy's name. He stepped closer and knelt, his gaze fixed on the baby. He gently touched Nokosi's forehead. His hand lingered. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he looked at the intricate beadwork on the hide wrap. His breath hitched, a tiny, almost imperceptible sound. "Where did you get this child?" he asked, his voice suddenly sharp, intense. "I found him," Clara said. "Out on the prairie, near where my home was." The man's eyes flicked to her, and for the first time she saw them clearly. They were pale, almost silver, and they seemed to see right through her. He reached out and gently took the hide wrap, his fingers tracing the beadwork, his touch almost reverent. Then he looked at the small wooden bead with the red symbol, the one tucked into the pattern. "And this?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "Did you find this too?" Clara's hand went instinctively to her pocket, where her own matching bead was hidden. How could he know? The man didn't wait for an answer. He looked from the bead on the wrap to Clara's face, a dawning, impossible understanding in his strange eyes. He stood up abruptly and disappeared back into the crack in the rock. Clara's heart sank. He was sending her away. But a moment later he returned, carrying a pouch of herbs and a wooden bowl. "Hold him steady," he commanded. She obeyed without question. He worked quickly, silently, crushing herbs, mixing them with water from a hidden spring. He created a dark, fragrant paste and gently rubbed it on Nokosi's chest and forehead. He brewed a tea, the steam smelling of sage and something else, something wild and ancient. He dipped a corner of her shawl in the tea and squeezed a few drops into the baby's mouth. Hours passed. The man didn't speak. He just worked, his movements sure and practiced. Clara watched, huddled by a small fire he had built, not daring to hope. As the first light of dawn crept into the canyon, Nokosi stirred. His eyes fluttered open. He coughed, a small, weak sound, but a sound of life. His fever had broken. Clara let out a sob of pure relief. She looked at the strange man, her eyes filled with more gratitude than she could ever express. "Thank you," she whispered. He just grunted, staring into the fire. "He will live," he said. Then he looked at her, his silver eyes pinning her in place. "But you have brought something more than a sick child to my mountain, girl. You have brought a war." He reached into his own worn leather vest and pulled out a cord. Dangling from it was a bead, a wooden bead, carved with a familiar red symbol. It was identical to hers, identical to the one on Nokosi's wrap. "My name is not Man of the Mountain," he said, his voice low and heavy, with a history she couldn't fathom. "My name is Silas, and that bead, it is the mark of the men who murdered my family. The same men, I'd wager, who murdered yours." Clara stared at him, her world fracturing all over again. The raiders, the men who burned her home and killed her parents. They weren't Apache, they were white men. Men who used a carved arrow and a single bead as their calling card. Men who had, for some reason, left an Apache baby behind in the ashes. "Who are they?" she breathed. Silas's face hardened into a mask of pure hatred. "They call themselves the Righteous, a company of ex-soldiers led by a madman, a man who believes he's been sent by God to cleanse this land." He paused, his eyes burning into hers. "A man you know, Preacher Loudon." The name hit her like a physical blow. The preacher, the man who had whipped the town into a frenzy, the man who wanted Nkosi dead. It wasn't about faith. It was about tying up a loose end. It was about silencing the only two witnesses to his crime. "He's not a man of God," Silas snarled. "He's a monster, and he won't stop until you and that child are in the ground." The sound of a distant gunshot echoed through the canyon. Silas was on his feet in an instant, grabbing a long rifle from the shadows. "They found us," he said grimly. "The preacher's posse." He looked at Clara, at the baby now sleeping peacefully in her arms. "There's a back way out of this canyon, a path through the peaks. It will lead you to the sacred hills, to Apache land." "But they're the enemy," Clara said, the old lie still tangled in her thoughts. "The preacher is your enemy," Silas corrected her fiercely. "The boy's father is a great chief, Chief Nate. His people are camped in the sacred hills. They are your only hope. Show them the child. Show them the bead. They will understand." Another shot, closer this time. Voices shouted in the distance. "Go!" Silas yelled, shoving her toward a dark crevice. "I will buy you time. They came for a war. I'll give them one." Clara didn't hesitate. She scrambled into the crevice, into the darkness, the truth a cold, hard stone in her stomach. She was not running from the law. She was running from a murderer. And she was not running toward enemies. She was running toward the only family this child had left. She had to make it. For Nkosi, for her parents, for Silas. She climbed, the sound of gunfire echoing behind her, a brutal symphony marking the end of one life and the desperate beginning of another. The path was a treacherous goat trail, a jagged scar clinging to the side of the mountain. Clara climbed, her body screaming with exhaustion, her mind a whirlwind of terror and revelation. Preacher Loudon, the man in black, the voice of God in Grady's Crossing, was a killer, a monster hiding in plain sight. Her parents hadn't been killed by savages in a random raid. They had been murdered, executed, and Nkosi, he wasn't just a survivor, he was evidence. The gunfire behind her faded, replaced by the howl of the wind. She didn't know if Silas had survived. She prayed he had, but a cold knot of dread in her stomach told her the old man had chosen his final stand. He had traded his life for theirs, another debt she could never repay. She reached the summit as the sun began to set, painting the sky in brutal shades of orange and red. Below her, the land opened up into a vast rolling basin, and in the distance, a cluster of hills rose from the prairie, their peaks glowing in the last light of day. The sacred hills, Apache land, salvation. But then she saw the dust, a low cloud, moving fast, coming from the direction of Grady's Crossing. It was the posse. They had bypassed Silas's canyon. They were cutting her off. There were more than 10 of them now, a small army riding hard. And at their lead, two figures she recognized even from this distance. The broad slumped shoulders of Sheriff Braddock and the tall, rigid form of Preacher Loudon. They had seen her. A shout carried on the wind. There was nowhere left to hide. Panic seized her. Her legs felt like lead. She couldn't outrun them. Not carrying a baby. It was over. They had won. She sank to her knees, clutching Nkosi, a sob catching in her throat. But then Nkosi stirred. He reached up a tiny hand and touched her cheek. His dark eyes, so full of a strange, ancient wisdom, looked into hers. He wasn't crying. He wasn't afraid. He was just watching her. And in his gaze, she saw not just a baby, but the legacy of a people, the echo of a chief, the weight of a future. Silas hadn't died for her to give up. Her parents hadn't died for her to fail. A fire ignited in her chest, burning away the fear. She would not let them win. She got to her feet, her jaw set. She couldn't outrun them. But maybe she didn't have to. She started down the mountain, not back the way she came, but straight down the steep, rocky face, heading directly for the basin. It was a reckless, desperate gamble. She half ran, half slid down the scree slope, dust and pebbles flying around her. She fell, scraped her knees, got up, and kept going. The posse was closing in, their shouts growing louder, more triumphant. They were enjoying the chase. She reached the floor of the basin, her lungs on fire, her legs trembling. She stumbled to a halt beside a gnarled, ancient cedar tree. The ground was flat and open here, no escape. The riders surrounded her, their horses snorting and stamping, kicking up dust. Sheriff Braddock swung down from his horse, his face a mask of exhaustion and grim duty. "It's over, Clara May," he said, his voice breathless. "This has gone too far. Give me the child." Preacher Loudon dismounted with a smug, victorious smile. He held his Bible like a weapon. "The Lord has delivered the wicked into our hands," he proclaimed, his eyes burning with a cold, righteous fire. "You have been deceived, child, led astray by the devil. Now you will face your judgment." "No," Clara said, her voice small but clear. She clutched Nkosi so tightly he whimpered. The preacher's smile vanished. "You are in no position to refuse, girl. You carry the blood of murderers, an abomination." "You're the murderer," Clara shot back, her voice gaining strength. The men in the posse shifted uncomfortably. This was not what they were expecting. The preacher's face contorted in rage. "Lies! The prattling of a confused, sinful child." "I saw the bead," Clara yelled, her voice ringing out in the sudden silence. "The bead with the red mark, the one you leave behind. I found it in my home. It's the same one on his blanket. It wasn't the Apache, it was you." A wave of shock rippled through the posse. They looked from the preacher to the tiny girl, their certainty wavering. Sheriff Braddock stared at her, his mouth half open, a flicker of doubt, of horror in his eyes. He had seen that bead before, on the bodies of other victims, in other raids he had never been able to solve. He had dismissed it. Now the pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture of unimaginable evil. The preacher saw he was losing control. His face turned purple with fury. "She is possessed, a witch. Do not listen to her lies. Seize the child." One of the deputies, a man loyal to the preacher, raised his rifle. "Drop the baby, girl." "Wait," Braddock shouted, raising a hand. But it was too late. The preacher's fanaticism had taken root. The mob was turning. "Better fire than hate," Clara whispered, tears finally blurring her vision. She turned, ready to run, to do anything, to shield Nkosi with her own body. And that's when a sound split the air. A sound that was not of their world. A sound as ancient as the rocks, as powerful as the wind. A war cry. It came from everywhere at once. On the ridges above them, figures materialized from the twilight. Dozens of them, then hundreds. Silent, painted warriors, their bows drawn, their spears glinting in the dying light. The posse froze, their horses whinnying in terror. They were surrounded, trapped. A path opened through the warriors, and a single man walked forward. He was tall and regal, his face a mask of sorrow and fury. His hair was braided with silver, and he wore the markings of a great chief. He carried no weapon. He didn't need one. His presence was enough. He walked past the terrified posse as if they were stones. He stopped in front of Clara. He looked down at the child in her arms. His breath caught in his throat. "Nkosi," he whispered, the name of prayer. He looked at Clara, his eyes so much like his son's, searching hers. "You carried him." Clara could only nod, her strength finally failing. She gently unwrapped her shawl and held the baby out to his father. Chief Nate took his son, cradling him with a tenderness that made the air shimmer. The preacher, recovering from his shock, found his voice. "This is God's will," he shrieked. "We are beset by devils. Slay them. Slay them all." Chief Nate didn't even look at him. He simply handed Nkosi to one of his warriors and drew a line in the dust with his foot. A simple line, a boundary, a choice. Sheriff Braddock looked at the line in the dust. He looked at the hundreds of silent warriors. He looked at the hate-twisted face of the preacher, and he looked at the small, bloody, defiant girl who had just exposed a truth he had been too cowardly to see. He made his choice. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his coat and pulled out his tin star. the badge of his authority, the symbol of the law he was supposed to uphold. He looked at it for a long moment, then he let it drop into the dust on his side of the line. He turned his back on the preacher and walked away. The other men in the posse, their faces a mixture of fear and dawning shame, hesitated for only a second before turning their horses and following him, leaving the preacher alone, surrounded by a silent, waiting army. The preacher stood there, trembling with impotent rage, his evil finally laid bare. Chief Nate turned back to Clara. "You are a small thing," he said, his voice soft, "but your heart is a mountain." He reached into a pouch at his belt and pressed a small, smooth stone into her hand. On it was carved a symbol. "Shika," he said. "It means my heart." Clara looked at the stone. She looked at the chief and his son, reunited. She looked at the retreating figures of the posse. Justice finally, truly beginning. And for the first time since the fire, she felt something that felt like hope. The war was not over, but this battle had been won. The Apache camp was nestled deep within the sacred hills, a place of quiet strength and deep roots. Smoke from 100 small fires curled into the night sky, carrying the scent of cedar and roasting meat. It was a world away from the dust and fear of Grady's crossing. Here the silence was peaceful. Clara sat wrapped in a soft buffalo robe, sipping a warm, savory broth. Nkosi slept beside her, safe in a cradleboard decorated with protective symbols. She watched as Chief Nate walked through the camp, his son held close to his chest. He stopped to speak with the elders, with the women, with the other warriors. With each person, he would show them his son, and then he would point to Clara. She didn't understand their words, but she understood the looks in their eyes. Awe, respect, gratitude. They didn't see a stranger, a white girl. They saw a hero. They saw the little storm who had carried their future back to them. Later that night, as the drums began a slow rhythmic beat, Nate came and sat by her fire. For a long time, he just watched the flames. "The man you call preacher," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. "He is one of many. They have been hunting us for seasons, burning our winter camps, poisoning our streams. They dress as warriors to start fires between our tribes and the settlers. They want this land, and they will spill any blood, tell any lie to get it." The full, horrifying picture was now clear. Her family hadn't been a target. They had just been in the way, a convenient sacrifice to fuel the fires of hatred the preacher needed to achieve his goals. "And Silas?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The old man in the mountains?" Nate's face softened with a deep sadness. "He was not one of us by blood, but he was our brother. His wife was Apache. The preacher and his men killed her and their daughter many years ago. He has been a ghost in those mountains ever since, waiting for a chance at vengeance. He gave you that chance. His spirit will be honored." The drums grew louder. The warriors began to gather in the center of the camp. Nate stood and held out a hand to Clara. "Come," he said, "there is something you must see." He led her to the edge of the camp, to a high bluff overlooking the plains. In the distance, a single large fire burned brightly. It was in the direction of Grady's crossing. "What is it?" Clara asked. "Justice," Nate said simply. As they watched, a lone rider approached the camp from the darkness. It was Sheriff Braddock. He stopped his horse at the edge of the camp, dismounted, and walked forward. He did not come as a lawman, but as a man seeking to right a terrible wrong. He stopped before Nate and bowed his head. "The preacher is gone," Braddock said, his voice heavy. "He and his most loyal men tried to flee. They didn't get far." He looked toward the distant fire. "The rest of the town, they know the truth now. The men who rode with me, they are telling the story. The right story." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled something out. It was a Bible, the preacher's Bible. He handed it to Nate. Tucked inside the pages was not scripture, but maps, letters, and documents detailing the preacher's plans, listing the names of the powerful men who were funding his crusade. It was the proof, the weapon they needed to stop the war for good. "This doesn't fix what I let happen," Braddock said, his voice choked with shame. "But it's a start." He looked at Clara, his eyes full of a deep, painful regret. "I am sorry, Clara May." For everything. Clara just nodded. Forgiveness was a long road, but she saw the change in him. The badge in the dirt had not been an end, but a beginning. The next morning, as the sun rose over the sacred hills, the drums began again. This time, it was not for war or justice, but for celebration, a ceremony of naming. Chief Nate stood before his people, holding Nkosi high for all to see. He told the story of the fire, the flight, and the little girl who walked like a storm. He told them that Nkosi would carry his name, but he would also carry another. He will be called Nkosi Shika, Nate declared, his voice echoing through the hills. The bear's heart, to remind us that the strongest heart is not the one that fights, but the one that protects. Then he turned to Clara. And you, he said, his voice softening, you have no tribe, you have no kin, so we will give you one. He placed a hand on her shoulder. From this day forward, you are Clara May Danawa. Clara May, friend of the people. You will always have a home here. You will always have a family with us. A cheer rose from the hundreds of warriors, a sound so powerful it seemed to shake the very mountains. Clara looked out at their faces, and for the first time since she had stood in the ashes of her home, she did not feel alone. Weeks later, Tommy Keene found his way to the hills. He came not as a visitor, but as a friend. He and Clara sat on the bluff, watching the eagles circle in the sky. He told her how Grady's Crossing was changing, how the preacher's evil had been exposed, and how people were being forced to look at their own hatred. How Sheriff Braddock was working with the army, using the preacher's Bible to hunt down the rest of the righteous. You did it, Clara, Tommy said quietly. You changed everything. She looked at her hands. They were small, still the hands of a child, but they didn't feel small anymore. She had carried a baby. She had carried a secret. She had carried the truth. Maybe your world is on fire. Maybe you're surrounded by voices telling you who to hate, who to fear, and what to believe. Maybe you feel small and scared and utterly alone. But listen to this story. Remember the story of Clara May Delaney, a 7-year-old girl who lost everything and still chose compassion over hate. A little girl who stood against a mob, against a monster, armed with nothing but the truth and a baby in her arms. She proved that you don't need a badge or a pulpit or an army to change the world. All you need is a heart strong enough to carry someone else's. So look around. Find the person who is most alone. Find the voice that is being silenced and carry them. Protect them. Be their storm. Because sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply refusing to believe in the monsters everyone else sees. If this story of impossible bravery moved you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who needs to be reminded of the power of a single, courageous heart.